Before we delve into this story, please be advised that it contains themes of psychological suspense and unexplained events that some listeners may find unsettling. Listener discretion is advised. Imagine, if you will, the last sound a man ever makes. Not a gasp, not a cry, but the final deliberate words broadcast live to thousands, followed by an abrupt, chilling silence that echoes not just through the airwaves, but through the very fabric of reality itself. This isn't just a story about a missing person. It's about a man who vanished during his own show, leaving behind a mystery so profound, so utterly baffling, that it still haunts the quiet corners of late-night radio to this very day. It was a Tuesday night, October 27th, a date now etched into the shadowed history of local broadcasting. For years, David Miller had been the voice of reason, the late-night skeptic on WKLX 97.3 FM, the Night Owl. His show, Night Visions, was a sanctuary for the strange, a forum for the unexplained, but always anchored by David's unwavering, almost aggressive rationality. He was the guy who'd patiently dismantle ghost stories, expose psychic frauds, and offer scientific explanations for phenomena that sent shivers down other people's spines. His listeners loved him for it, a comforting presence cutting through the static of a lonely night. He was the lighthouse in a sea of conspiracy theories, the steady hand guiding you back to shore. David himself was a creature of habit. Every night, precisely at 11 p.m., he'd slide into his worn leather chair in Studio A, a lukewarm coffee perpetually by his side, the faint hum of the mixing board his only companion until the phone lines lit up. He had a dry wit, a gravelly voice that could soothe or challenge, and eyes that held a certain weariness, the kind that comes from hearing countless tales of shadow figures and alien abductions. He'd seen it all, heard it all, and dismissed most of it with a polite, yet firm professionalism. But that Tuesday night, something was different. The air in Studio A felt heavy charged, even before David went live. He'd chalked it up to a long day, a lingering headache, but an inexplicable prickle had been crawling up his spine since he walked through the station doors. Sarah Jenkins, his producer and call screener, a no-nonsense woman with a perpetual ponytail and an encyclopedic knowledge of local weirdos, had even commented on it. "You look like you've seen a ghost, David," she joked, handing him his usual lukewarm coffee. He'd forced a smile, but the joke felt less like humor and more like prophecy. The first hour of Night Visions was standard fare. A woman from downstate called and convinced her house was haunted by a poltergeist that kept rearranging her Tupperware. David calmly suggested she check for carbon monoxide leaks. A young man shared an elaborate theory about Bigfoot being an interdimensional traveler. David gently reminded him about Occam's razor. It was all predictable, comforting in its absurdity, and David was in his element, debunking, explaining, bringing a dose of reality to the fantastical. Then just past midnight, the phone lines went quiet. Sarah usually had a cue, but for a moment the screen was blank. David glanced at her through the soundproof glass partition. She shrugged, a flicker of confusion crossing her face. "Must be a lull," she mouthed. David nodded, cleared his throat, and launched into a brief monologue about the human brain's propensity for pattern recognition, even in random noise. He was mid-sentence when a line finally lit up, flashing green. "Got one, David," Sarah's voice crackled in his earpiece. "Caller ID says blocked. Sounds interesting." She paused, a slight frown forming. "Says his name is Elias. Wants to talk about frequencies." David raised an eyebrow. "Frequencies? All right, put him through, Sarah. Let's see what Elias has for us tonight." He switched on the caller's mic, a small red light illuminating. "Welcome to Night Visions, Elias. You're on the air. What's on your mind?" The voice that came through the speakers was unlike anything David had heard before. It wasn't distorted by a cheap phone connection or a voice changer. It was multi-layered, like several voices speaking in unison, yet one, a low, resonant hum beneath the words, almost as if the caller was speaking from a great distance, or through a medium that wasn't entirely solid. It was calm, deliberate, and utterly chilling. "David," the voice began, and the way it pronounced his name sent an unexpected shiver down his spine. It wasn't a question, but a statement of intimate knowledge. "You spend your nights chasing shadows, dissolving myths, always seeking the logical. But what if the logic you cling to is merely a curtain, pulled tight to obscure the stage behind it?" David leaned forward, a flicker of genuine interest, perhaps even annoyance, replacing his usual detached amusement. This wasn't a standard crackpot. Elias, I'm all for philosophical debate, but let's stick to the topic. You wanted to talk about frequencies. Indeed, Elias replied, the hum beneath his words seeming to intensify. The airwaves, David. You think they merely carry sound, but they carry much more. They are pathways, conduits, and WKLX, your very station, sits upon a particularly potent nexus, a place where the veil between what you perceive as reality and what is reality is thin. David scoffed, a nervous habit. All right, Elias, let's not get too mystical. We're a local station, broadcasting from a converted warehouse in downtown Crestwood. I assure you, there are no ancient ley lines or dimensional portals in our HVAC system. Sarah, on the other side of the glass, was now watching him intently, her usual boredom replaced by a look of intrigued apprehension. You mock, David, as is your way, Elias continued, completely unfazed. But you know deep down that there are whispers in the static, frequencies you can almost grasp just at the edge of hearing, the ones that seep into your dreams, the ones that have been calling to you specifically for weeks now. This hit a nerve. David's dreams had been strange lately, fragmented images, discordant sounds he couldn't place, a persistent feeling of being watched, even in his sleep. He dismissed it as stress, too much coffee, but hearing it articulated by this strange caller sent a jolt through him. How would you know about my dreams, Elias? David's voice was sharper now, a defensive edge creeping in. Because the pathways are open, David, and you, in your relentless pursuit of truth, have been unknowingly pushing them wider. Your skepticism is a powerful current, but even currents can be harnessed. The station, this very studio, is a focusing lens. And tonight, David, the focus is complete. A cold dread began to coil in David's stomach. This wasn't a prank. This wasn't a fan. This felt personal and menacing. What exactly are you implying, Elias? David asked, trying to keep his voice steady, professional. Are you threatening me? A soft, almost sorrowful chuckle emanated from the speaker, a sound that seemed to vibrate in David's skull. Threatening? No, David. I am merely observing the inevitable. You are about to complete your final broadcast. The signal you've been putting out, the one that denies the unseen, it has reached its destination. And now the unseen is ready to reply. Live. Then, without another word, without a click or a dial tone, the line went dead. The red light on the mixing board blinked out. The hum beneath Elias's voice vanished, leaving behind an oppressive, echoing silence in the studio. David stared at the defunct line, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Sarah was staring at him, her mouth slightly agape, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and disbelief. David swallowed hard, trying to regain his composure. He cleared his throat, searching for a witty retort, a dismissive line to reassure himself and his listeners. Well, folks, he began, his voice a little too shaky. That was certainly something. Seems Elias had a rather vivid imagination, or perhaps a faulty phone line. Or maybe he just ran out of profound pronouncements. He forced a laugh, but it sounded hollow, brittle. He glanced at the clock. 12:17 a.m. Still plenty of show left. He tried to signal Sarah for the next call, but she was still frozen, her gaze fixed on something behind him. David frowned, turning slowly in his chair. The studio was just as it had been. The soundproofing panels, the muted lights, the stacks of old CDs. Nothing. Yet a palpable chill had descended, raising goosebumps on his arms. The air felt thick, heavy, as if the very oxygen had been replaced by something else, something unseen and ancient. A faint, almost imperceptible whisper seemed to brush against his ear, a sound like dry leaves skittering across pavement, or perhaps the distant echo of 1,000 forgotten voices. David reached for his coffee, his hand trembling slightly. It was ice cold. He looked back at Sarah, who was now slowly shaking her head, her face pale. He knew with a certainty that pierced through his skepticism that Elias hadn't just hung up. Something had taken his call, and it was still on the line. The receiver felt like a block of ice in his hand, a chilling testament to the impossible. The line was open, humming with a low, almost imperceptible static, yet no one was there. Not Elias, not a dial tone, just an emptiness that felt heavier than any sound. David slowly lowered the phone, his eyes locked on Sarah. Her lips were moving, forming silent words he couldn't hear over the internal ringing in his ears. Her face, usually so vibrant and full of life, was now a mask of stark white fear. He tried to speak, to utter some banality, some technical explanation, but his throat felt constricted. The air in the studio, moments ago a comfortable 70 degrees, had plummeted. A frigid draft snaked around his ankles, then crept up his spine, raising goosebumps on his arms. He shivered, a deep involuntary tremor that shook him to his core. "Sarah," he managed, his voice a raspy whisper. What was that?" She finally found her voice, though it was barely a breath. I don't know, David. He just vanished. And then..." She gestured vaguely at the phone, then around the room, as if something invisible had just swept through. He picked up the receiver again, pressing it to his ear, listening intently. The static intensified for a split second, a crackle like dry leaves underfoot, then faded back to that unsettling hum. He pressed the mute button on his console, cutting off his microphone to the audience, though he didn't really know why. Was he protecting them from what he might hear? Or protecting himself from what he might say? "Hello?" he tried, his voice louder this time, tinged with a forced bravado. "Elias? Is anyone there?" Silence. A profound, echoing silence that seemed to absorb all other sounds, even the distant, muffled thrum of the city outside. Then, so faint he almost dismissed it as his imagination, a sound. Not a voice, not a whisper, but a sigh. A long, drawn-out exhalation that seemed to emanate not from the phone, but from the very air around him. It was cold, mournful, and utterly devoid of human presence. Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She'd heard it too. "Did you?" David started, but she cut him off with a frantic shake of her head. Her eyes were wide, darting around the small, soundproofed room as if expecting something to materialize from the shadows. He slammed the receiver back into its cradle with more force than necessary. The sudden disconnect produced a sharp, metallic clang that seemed to reverberate unnaturally in the chilled air. "Technical glitch," he mumbled, more to himself than to Sarah. "A short. Or a prank. A very elaborate, very disturbing prank." But even as the words left his lips, he knew they were hollow. Elias's terror had been too real, too raw. The feeling in the studio, the sudden drop in temperature, the phantom sigh. This wasn't a prank. This was something else entirely. The lights in the studio began to flicker. Not a gentle, almost imperceptible waver, but a violent strobe, plunging the room into momentary darkness before snapping back to full illumination, only to dim again. The digital clock on the wall, usually a steady, glowing red, glitched, its numbers scrambling into an indecipherable mess before resetting to the correct time, then repeating the distorted dance. "David!" Sarah's voice was barely audible, a fragile thread. "The board." He looked down at his mixing console. The array of lights and indicators, usually a symphony of green and amber, were now behaving erratically. Faders were creeping up and down on their own, controls were flashing, and a low, persistent hum was emanating from the speakers, growing steadily louder, a discordant drone that grated on his nerves. He reached for the master fader, intending to cut the sound to regain some control, but his hand froze. A ripple, like water on a pond, seemed to pass over the surface of the console. The plastic casing felt strangely warm, almost alive, beneath his fingertips. Then a single red light, usually reserved for the on-air indicator, began to pulse on the channel that had been connected to Elias. It pulsed slowly, deliberately, like a heartbeat. "It's still active," Sarah whispered, her voice laced with terror. "The line. It's still open." David stared at the pulsing red light, a grim fascination overcoming his immediate fear. He hadn't pressed anything. He had slammed the phone down. How could the line still be open? How could that channel still be active? He leaned closer to the console, a strange compulsion guiding him. The hum intensified, and then from the speakers he heard it again. Not a sigh this time, but a faint, almost subliminal static that seemed to coalesce into something resembling a whisper. It was too indistinct to make out words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was a sound of immense, ancient sorrow, laced with an undercurrent of something deeply malevolent. He felt a cold breath on his neck, despite the fact that the studio was a sealed environment. He whipped his head around, expecting to see something, anything, but there was only the empty air, shimmering faintly in the flickering lights. "We have to stop the broadcast," Sarah pleaded, her eyes wide and wet. She was pointing at the on-air light, which glowed steadily, a beacon of their continued connection to the outside world, to their unsuspecting audience. David hesitated. His show, Night Echoes, was his life. He was a professional. He didn't abandon his post. But this was beyond unprofessional. This was beyond anything he'd ever encountered. His mind, usually sharp and analytical, was struggling to piece together a coherent explanation. A power surge? A sophisticated hack? A mass hallucination induced by stress? None of it fit. "No," he said, his voice stronger now though still hoarse. A strange defiance was rising within him, battling the pure, unadulterated fear. "We don't. Not yet. If this is real, if something out there is doing this, then we need to know what it wants. We need to expose it." Sarah stared at him, her face a mixture of disbelief and growing horror. "Expose what, David? A ghost? A demon? We're on live radio. People are listening." "Exactly," he retorted, the words tumbling out. "People are listening. Elias called us. Whatever this is, it reached out through him. Maybe it wants to be heard. Maybe it wants to tell us something." He was rationalizing, he knew, trying to find a footing in the quicksand of the impossible, but a part of him, a deeply buried, reckless part, was genuinely curious. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his racing heart. He reached for his microphone, the one connected to the on-air channel. His hand trembled as he flipped the switch. The red light glowed steadily, indicating he was live. "To our listeners," he began, his voice surprisingly calm, though a tremor was evident beneath the surface. "What you've just heard, or perhaps what you haven't heard, was not a technical malfunction. It was not a prank." He paused, letting the weight of his words hang in the air, knowing that thousands of people were now leaning closer to their radios, their phones, their smart speakers. He glanced at Sarah, who had buried her face in her hands, shaking her head slowly. "We just experienced something profoundly unsettling here in the studio," he continued, his gaze sweeping around the darkened, flickering room. "A caller, Elias, vanished mid-sentence, and since then we've been experiencing phenomena. Unexplained electrical disturbances, extreme drops in temperature, and a presence. A very distinct, very cold presence that feels like it's right here with us." As he spoke, the low hum from the speakers intensified. The pulsing red light on Elias's channel began to flash faster, matching the erratic beat of his own heart. The air grew even colder, so much so that he could see his own breath misting faintly in front of him. "I know this sounds unbelievable," David admitted, his voice dropping slightly. "And frankly, a part of me, the rational part, is still struggling to accept it. But what we heard from Elias, the terror in his voice, it was real. And what we're experiencing now, it's also real." Suddenly, the hum from the speakers wasn't just a hum anymore. It was forming, coalescing into something more structured. It was like a voice, but not a human voice. It was deep, resonant, and seemed to vibrate from within the very walls of the studio. It was slow, deliberate, and each syllable stretched out, distorted like a message played backward and then marginally corrected. Sarah cried out, a small choke sound. She pointed a trembling finger at the large monitor screen that usually displayed the show's run list and upcoming segments. The text was dissolving, replaced by a single glowing white word, slowly forming letter by agonizing letter. David's eyes widened in horror. The word shimmered, then solidified, burning itself into his vision. "Found." It was there, stark and undeniable on the screen. And as the final letter appeared, the deep, resonant voice from the speakers, now unmistakably clearer, echoed the word, drawing it out into an impossibly long, chilling sound that seemed to snake around him, through him, and settle deep within the marrow of his bones. He could feel it now, an invisible weight pressing down on him, a presence that was no longer just in the air, but inside the studio, surrounding them, consuming them. The cold was no longer just a draft. It was an oppressive, suffocating force. His hand, still on the microphone switch, felt numb. He wanted to cut the broadcast, to scream, to run. But he couldn't move. He couldn't even breathe properly. The red on-air light continued to glow, connecting him, connecting Sarah, connecting his entire audience, to whatever terrifying entity had just announced its arrival. And he knew with a sickening certainty that this was just the beginning. The air in the studio, already thick with the stale scent of forgotten coffee and electronic hum, suddenly felt glacial, pressing in on David from all sides. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drum solo against the impossible silence that had fallen after that final guttural announcement. And he knew with a sickening certainty that this was just the beginning. The words echoed in his mind, not his own, but the chilling prophecy of whatever horror had just hijacked his show. He stared at the microphone, its silver mesh now seeming to glitter with an alien malevolence. His hand, still hovering over the fader, was trembling so violently he could feel the tremor shoot up his arm, making his teeth clench. Sarah across the glass was a statue of abject terror, her eyes wide, glassy, fixed on him. Her mouth was open, a silent scream trapped behind the soundproof barrier. David finally snapped out of his paralysis. His fingers, stiff and uncooperative, fumbled for the off-air button. It was a large, red, inviting target, promising an end to this nightmare, a severing of the terrifying connection. He slammed his palm down on it. Nothing. The red on-air light continued its mocking glow. He hit it again, harder, his desperation mounting. Still nothing. The button felt dead, unresponsive, as if the console itself had been possessed. "Sarah," he mouthed, his voice a strangled whisper that wouldn't clear his throat. He pointed frantically at the off-air button, then at the main power switch for the entire board. Sarah, her face drained of all color, seemed to understand. She lunged forward, her chair scraping loudly across the linoleum floor, a sound that, even through the glass, felt like a gunshot in the oppressive quiet. She reached for the master power, her fingers brushing against the cold plastic. And then a low guttural growl vibrated through the studio. It wasn't coming from the speakers, not from the microphone. It was everywhere and nowhere, a vibration in the very air, a deep resonance that settled in David's bones. It felt like the building itself was alive, angry. The growl intensified, a low rumble that vibrated the very floor beneath David's feet. The red on-air light pulsed, growing brighter, then dimming in sync with the sinister rhythm. Sarah recoiled, her hand snatching back from the power switch as if burned. Her eyes, meeting David's through the glass, were no longer just terrified. They held a primal, raw horror he'd never seen in her before. She shook her head slowly, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. She couldn't cut the power. Something was preventing it. David's breath hitched. This wasn't a prank. This wasn't a hack. This was something else entirely. Something ancient and malevolent, something that defied the laws of physics and broadcasting. He was trapped. They were both trapped. And the entire city, maybe even beyond, was listening. "Hello," David croaked, his voice barely a whisper into the dead mic. He knew it was futile, knew it was insane, but the silence felt worse, more menacing than any sound. "Is anyone there?" The growl subsided, replaced by a new sound, faint at first, then growing in intensity. It was a high-pitched whine like feedback, but wrong. It was too organic, too distorted, a sound that seemed to scrape against the inside of his skull. It built, rising in pitch and volume, until it was a piercing shriek that made David clap his hands over his ears, wincing. He looked at Sarah, who was doing the same, her face contorted in pain. The shriek reached an unbearable crescendo, then abruptly cut out. The silence that followed was even more profound, a heavy, suffocating blanket. David slowly lowered his hands, his ears ringing. He glanced at the soundboard. All the faders were still at their normal levels. The dials hadn't moved. Nothing. But the sound had been real. Painfully real. He looked at the clock on the wall. It had stopped. Not just the seconds hand, but the entire display. Frozen at 1:17 a.m. He remembered the exact moment the voice had first spoken. It had been 1:17 a.m. A chill, colder than anything he'd ever felt, snaked down his spine. It wasn't just disrupting the broadcast. It was disrupting time itself. "David," Sarah mouthed, her voice finally audible through the intercom, though it was a strained, shaky whisper. "The phones. They're dead. I can't get an outbound signal. I tried calling security 911. Nothing." His heart sank further. No help. No escape. Just him, Sarah, and whatever was broadcasting through his frequency. He tried to speak, but his throat was dry, constricted. He reached for his water bottle, his hand shaking so badly he almost dropped it. He took a long, desperate gulp, splashing water onto his shirt. "Okay," he finally managed, his voice hoarse. He cleared his throat, trying to project an air of control he was far from feeling. "Okay, Sarah. Just stay calm. We need to figure this out." He knew it was a lie, a pathetic attempt to reassure them both. There was no figuring this out. This was beyond human comprehension. But he was a radio host. His job was to talk, to fill the air, to make sense of the nonsensical. To our listeners, David began, his voice surprisingly steady, considering the earthquake of terror rumbling through his chest. He was talking to the mic, to the unknown entity, to the millions of potential listeners, and to himself. We seem to be experiencing some technical difficulties. We apologize for the interruption. He forced a nervous chuckle, a sound that died a miserable death in the air. We're working to resolve the issue. As he spoke, a faint, almost imperceptible scratching sound began to emanate from the studio speakers. It was like fingernails dragging across an old blackboard, but softer, more insidious. It was subtle, easily dismissed as static, but David felt it deep in his gut. This was no static. This was intentional. The scratching grew, becoming more rhythmic, more deliberate. It was moving, shifting from speaker to speaker, creating a horrifying surround sound symphony of dread. It felt like something was trying to claw its way out of the very walls of the studio, out of the broadcast itself. Then, amidst the scratching, a new sound began to filter through. A distant, mournful wail. It was faint, almost subliminal, but undeniably there. It sounded like a child crying, lost and alone in an echoing cavern. The sound sent a fresh wave of ice through David's veins. This wasn't random. This was personal. He thought of the caller, the one who had brought this all to his doorstep. Michael, the man who had described a chilling entity, a presence that fed on fear. Was this it? Was this the entity Michael had warned him about? And if so, what did it want? The wailing intensified, merging with the scratching, forming a cacophony of despair and malevolence. David could feel his carefully constructed composure crumbling. He gripped the edge of the console, his knuckles white. He had to do something. Anything. He looked at the monitor displaying the station's live web stream. The numbers were climbing. Not dropping, not stagnating. Climbing. Thousands. Tens of thousands. People were tuning in. They were hearing this. They were experiencing this nightmare with him. The thought brought a fresh wave of panic and a horrifying realization. This entity wasn't just trapped in the studio. It was broadcasting itself to the world, using his voice, his platform. The wailing reached a crescendo, then fractured, breaking into a chorus of whispers. Hissing, sibilant whispers that seemed to coil around his head, slithering into his ears. He couldn't make out individual words, but the sheer volume of them, the sheer presence they conveyed, was overwhelming. It felt like 1,000 unseen mouths were pressed against the glass, breathing their secrets into the room. David squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block out the auditory assault, but it was useless. The whispers were inside his head, echoing in the hollow space where his sanity used to reside. He felt a sudden sharp pain behind his eyes, a pressure building as if his skull was about to crack. He opened his eyes, gasping. The studio lights, which had been steady, began to flicker wildly. Not just dimming but flashing, strobing, casting grotesque, dancing shadows across the walls. The equipment around him, the faders, the buttons, the glowing screens, all seemed to pulse with a sickly, greenish light, like bioluminescent organisms in the deepest ocean. The air grew heavy, thick with an acrid metallic tang, like ozone mixed with something rotten. David coughed, a dry, hacking sound. He could barely breathe. He looked at Sarah, through the strobing lights and the distorted reflections. She was slumped against the glass, her face buried in her hands, her body shaking uncontrollably. She was crying deep, guttural sobs that resonated even through the soundproof barrier. He knew he couldn't break down. Not yet. He was on air. He was a professional. He had to maintain some semblance of control, even if only for the sake of the terrified woman across from him. But the whispers, the wails, the flickering lights, the suffocating air, it was all designed to break him. Then a single voice, clear and distinct, cut through the cacophony. It was the same voice from before, the one that had announced its arrival. But this time it was closer, impossibly close, right in his ear, as if whispering directly into his mind. "You have opened the door, David," the voice hissed, a chilling, intimate sound that bypassed his ears and resonated directly in his skull. "And now you will guide them through." David froze, his blood turning to ice. Guide them through? Guide who? And through what? The studio around him seemed to twist and contort, the walls breathing, the shadows deepening into hungry maw. He was no longer just a radio host. He was a conduit, and the entity had just given him his terrifying new mission. Michael's breath hitched, a ragged gasp caught in his throat that thankfully didn't make it to the airwaves. Not yet. The voice, no longer just a whisper in his mind, but a resonant hum vibrating through the very bones of the studio, had laid out its demands with chilling clarity. It wasn't about a single act of violence or a grand theatrical display of power. It was far more insidious, far more devastating. The entity wanted him to dismantle trust, to fray the delicate threads that held communities, families, even individuals together. It wanted him to use his voice, his platform, to expose, to twist, to ignite suspicion where there was none, and to amplify every hidden doubt until it became an undeniable, crushing certainty. "You will speak," the voice echoed, not from the speakers but from the air itself, of the betrayal festering beneath the surface, of the secrets whispered in the dark, of the insidious truths people refused to see, until you forced their eyes open. Michael felt a cold dread seep into his marrow. This wasn't just a violation of his professional ethics, it was a violation of his very soul. He was a voice of comfort, of late-night companionship, not a harbinger of chaos. His show, Night Owl Confessions, was built on shared vulnerabilities, on finding common ground in the quiet hours. This was the antithesis of everything he stood for. He tried to speak, to protest, but his jaw felt locked, his tongue a leaden weight in his mouth. The studio around him pulsed, a low rhythmic thrumming that seemed to synchronize with his frantic heartbeat. The mixing board lights flickered, not randomly, but in a chaotic dance that mirrored the unraveling thoughts in his head. The clock on the wall, usually a steadfast sentinel of time, seemed to blur, its hands spinning erratically before snapping back to a frozen, unsettling stop. "Refuse," the entity purred, a sound like dry leaves skittering across a tombstone, "and the silence will be deafening. Not just for your audience, Michael, but for you, and for every soul you hold dear. Their secrets will be laid bare, not by your voice but by a far crueler hand, their trust shattered, their lives irrevocably broken, and you will be left to witness it all powerless, in the suffocating quiet." The threat was a precise surgical strike, targeting his deepest fears. His sister Sarah, who confided in him more than anyone. His elderly mother Martha, who relied on his daily calls. Even Emily, his producer, whose quiet competence and unwavering loyalty had been a constant in his chaotic life. The entity knew. It knew his vulnerabilities, his connections, his anchor points in the world. A wave of nausea washed over him, bile rising in his throat. He clutched the edge of his desk, his knuckles white. This wasn't a choice, it was an ultimatum. He was being forced to become a weapon, to inflict wounds he couldn't see, on people he didn't know, using the very tool he cherished most, his voice. He looked at the microphone, once an extension of his personality, now a loaded gun pointed at the world. He had to resist. He had to. "I won't," he whispered, the words barely audible even to himself, a defiant spark against a crushing darkness. "I won't do it." The studio plunged into an unnerving silence, a quiet so profound it felt like the air itself had been sucked out of the room. Then a low guttural growl vibrated through the floorboards, through his chair straight into his bones. The temperature in the room plummeted, and he could see his own breath misting in the frigid air. "You will," the voice thundered, no longer a purr, but a roar that rattled the soundproofing on the walls. "Or you will regret the day you ever sought to connect." A series of images flashed through Michael's mind, vivid and terrifying. Not memories but projections. He saw Sarah's face, contorted in anguish, her deepest shame broadcast for all to hear. He saw his mother alone and weeping, her carefully constructed world crumbling around her. He saw Emily, her career destroyed, her reputation in tatters, looking at him with an expression of utter betrayal. These weren't just threats, they felt like premonitions, sealed by the entity's malevolent will. His resolve crumbled, replaced by a cold, paralyzing fear. He couldn't risk it. He couldn't be the cause of such devastation for the people he loved. He was trapped, a puppet on strings he couldn't see, pulled by a master he couldn't comprehend. What do you want me to say?" he choked out, his voice raw, defeated. The words tasted like ash. The entity's presence seemed to recede slightly, the oppressive chill easing, though the underlying dread remained. "Tonight, It began, its voice returning to that unnerving hum. You will speak of the man who watches, the man who listens, the man who knows the hidden truths of this city. You will tell them he is among them always, that their secrets are not safe. You will sow the seeds of suspicion, Michael. You will make them look at their neighbors, their friends, their loved ones and wonder, what do they hide? Michael stared blankly at the microphone. This was a direct attack on the fabric of society, designed to erode trust, to foster paranoia. It was psychological warfare waged through the airwaves, and he was the unwilling general. But who is he? Michael stammered, trying to grasp at some shred of logic, some discernible target. What man? The entity's response was a chilling, almost playful chuckle. He is everyone. He is no one. He is the fear itself given a face. You will describe him as the shadow in the periphery, the whisper in the dark, the doubt in the heart. You will paint a portrait of an omnipresent observer, a collector of hidden shames, a judge of unspoken sins. And you will make them believe he is real. Because Michael, he is. The last two words resonated with an undeniable, terrifying truth that settled deep in Michael's gut. The entity wasn't just making him parrot a lie, it was making him manifest a new reality. He was to create a boogeyman, a collective paranoia, and in doing so perhaps give it life. He felt a tremor run through his entire body. His hand, still clutching the desk, began to shake uncontrollably. He glanced at the clock again. It was still frozen. Time had stopped for him, or rather had been twisted into a new, agonizing dimension. The red on-air light on his console glowed mockingly, a beacon of his involuntary servitude. He had to get through this segment. He had to pretend. He had to perform. And he had to do it convincingly, or the consequences would be dire. Not just for him, but for those he loved. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, Michael forced himself to straighten up. He adjusted the microphone, a practiced motion that felt utterly alien now. He could feel the entity's presence, a cold, watchful weight, urging him on, its unseen gaze boring into his skull. He cleared his throat, the sound rough and strained. He needed to sound calm, reassuring, like the Michael his listeners knew. The Michael who offered solace, not dread. The dissonance between his internal terror and the persona he was about to project was almost unbearable. "Welcome back, night owls," he began, his voice cracking slightly before he managed to smooth it out, forcing a semblance of his usual warmth. "It's just past 2 in the morning, and we're diving deep tonight. Deeper than usual, I think." He paused, the silence stretching, pregnant with unspoken fear. He could almost hear the collective breath held by his unseen audience. He imagined them, huddled in their homes, listening in the dark, seeking comfort. And he was about to shatter that comfort. "You know," he continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, a trick he often used to draw listeners in. "We all have secrets, don't we? Little things, big things. Things we tell no one. Things we bury so deep we almost convince ourselves they never happened. But what if someone else knows? What if there's always an eye watching? An ear listening, even when you think you're utterly alone?" He felt a jolt, a surge of power as he spoke these words. It wasn't his own power. It was the entity's flowing through him, invigorating the broadcast itself. The air in the studio seemed to thicken, charged with an invisible energy. "Imagine a presence," Michael continued, his voice gaining an eerie resonance, no longer quite his own. "A shadow that moves through the city, unseen, unheard. It slips through the cracks between the moments, into the quiet corners of your lives. It doesn't need a name or a face. It doesn't need to knock on your door, as it's already there. It's in the way your neighbor glances at you a little too long. It's in the anonymous note left on your windshield. It's in the sudden, inexplicable chill that sweeps through a room when no window is open." His words flowed, not from his conscious mind, but as if dictated by an unseen force. He was articulating the entity's vision, giving form to its malevolent intent. He could feel the weight of each word, the potential for fear and distrust they carried. "This presence," he elaborated, his voice now a low, hypnotic drone. "It thrives on what we hide. It feeds on our unspoken anxieties. It collects our shames like trinkets, polishing them, holding them up to a dark, unseen light. And it knows. It knows the lie you told your spouse last week. It knows the shortcut you took on your taxes. It knows the resentment you harbor for a colleague, the dark thought you had about a stranger. It knows everything. A cold sweat beaded on his forehead, but he couldn't stop. The words were a torrent, an unstoppable tide. He was an instrument, a mouthpiece for something ancient and deeply sinister. "And here's the terrifying part, night owls," Michael said, leaning closer to the microphone, his voice barely a whisper, yet amplified to fill every corner of the broadcast. "This presence, it's not just observing. It's waiting for the moment when those secrets, those hidden truths begin to unravel. Waiting for the trust to break. Waiting for the paranoia to take root. Because when it does, when we start to suspect each other, when we start to fear what our closest confidants might be hiding, that's when it truly begins to awaken. That's when the city truly starts to change. And you, my friends, are the ones who will open the door." He pulled back from the microphone, his chest heaving, his body trembling. He had done it. He had delivered the message. The studio felt heavy, thick with the residue of his words, of the entity's influence. The red on-air light still glowed, a silent witness to his descent. He looked at his shaking hands, then back at the microphone, a profound sense of defilement washing over him. He had just become a purveyor of dread, an architect of fear. And the broadcast, his sanctuary, his connection to the world, had become his cage. The final broadcast of a doomed radio host had truly begun. And the terrifying part was, he was only just getting started. The air in the studio, once a comforting blanket of familiar sounds and equipment hum, now felt like a suffocating shroud. Michael stared at the blinking on-air light, a beacon of his professional life, now a mocking eye witnessing his private horror. The realization had hit him like a physical blow. He wasn't just hosting a show, he was performing a puppet show, and the strings were not his own. His sanctuary, his connection to the world, had indeed become his cage. And the terrifying part was, he was only just getting started. A cold dread seeped into his bones, colder than the studio's air conditioning. He could feel it, a subtle, insidious pressure behind his eyes, a phantom hand twisting his gut. It wasn't a voice he heard, not yet, but a compulsion. A dark current flowing through his veins, urging him, steering him. His throat felt tight, his tongue heavy, yet he knew with a certainty that made his skin crawl, that when he opened his mouth, the words would come. They would not be his. He swallowed hard, the sound amplified in his own ears through the headphones. The instrumental break was ending. He had to speak. He looked at the clock, the red digits mocking him with the passage of time. He was supposed to introduce the next segment, take a call, keep the late-night momentum going. But the compulsion was shaping his thoughts, twisting them into something alien. He leaned into the microphone, his usual smooth, confident persona a fragile mask barely concealing the terror in his eyes. "Welcome back, my nocturnal companions," he began, his voice surprisingly steady, a testament to years of practice, yet there was a tremor, a subtle, almost imperceptible waver that only the most attuned listener might catch. "We're deep into the night now, aren't we? That special time when the world quiets down, and the whispers begin. The whispers of the things we try to ignore during the day." He paused, a beat longer than usual. His mind screamed, "No. Don't say that." But the words were already out, forming a path he hadn't intended. He felt a chilling sense of helplessness. He had just diverted from his planned script, from his usual patter. He was supposed to segue into a light-hearted listener story about a bizarre dream, but instead he felt drawn to this darker, more unsettling topic. "Some whispers," he continued, the words flowing with an eerie ease, "are just the wind. Others are secrets. Secrets we bury deep, hoping they'll never see the light of day. But the night, my friends, has a way of digging them up, doesn't it?" He actually chuckled, a hollow, mirthless sound that felt wrong even to his own ears. It wasn't his laugh. It was a mimicry, a puppet's performance. Miles away in her small apartment, Sarah Chan, a night shift nurse on her break, frowned, her coffee mug halfway to her lips. She listened to Michael every night. His show, Midnight Musings, was her ritual, a soothing backdrop to the quiet hours. But tonight something was off. Michael, usually so charismatic and comforting, sounded different, more intense, a little unsettling. She usually loved his philosophical tangents, but this felt less like philosophy and more like a threat, or a plea. Back in the studio, Michael felt a surge of panic. He was losing control. He tried to steer the conversation back, to mention the listener story. "Speaking of secrets," he said, forcing a smile he knew no one could see. "We had a fascinating submission tonight from a listener named Jessica about a dream involving..." But the words caught in his throat. The pressure intensified. His head throbbed. He felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to scratch at his skin, to rip off the headphones, to scream. But he couldn't. He was frozen, locked in place by an invisible force. He could feel his heart hammering against his ribs, a frantic drum against the silence that stretched over the airwaves. Then the compulsion took over again, stronger this time. He felt his jaw move, his lips part. The words that came out were not Jessica's dream. "About a dream involving a locked door," he finished, his voice lower, almost a whisper, yet infused with a strange, compelling power. "A door that, once opened, reveals not what you expect, but what you deserve." Sarah gasped, nearly dropping her mug. What was that? That wasn't Michael. Or at least it wasn't the Michael she knew. His voice had changed, deepened, acquired a sinister edge. And the content, it was genuinely chilling. She reached for her phone, a sudden, inexplicable urge to record this segment washing over her. Michael, meanwhile, was fighting a losing battle within his own mind. He could feel the entity, the presence, whatever it was, coiling around his thoughts, whispering suggestions that felt like his own ideas, yet were utterly alien. He tried to focus on the studio around him, to ground himself in reality. The soundproofed walls, the mixing board, the array of equipment. But even these familiar objects seemed to shift, to become less reassuring, more confining. The heavy studio door, usually unlocked during his shift, now felt like a solid, impenetrable barrier. He tried the handle subtly, hoping to find it give, but it was locked tight. He felt a fresh wave of despair. "We all have locked doors in our lives, don't we?" Michael continued, the words pouring out, unbidden, yet perfectly articulated. His voice was now completely devoid of its usual warmth, replaced by a chilling, almost hypnotic cadence. "Secrets we keep, truths we hide, people we betray. And we think those doors will hold. We think the darkness inside will stay contained. But the night has teeth, my friends. It bites, and it tears, and it demands to be fed." He could feel a cold smile stretching his lips, a smile that wasn't his own. He was acutely aware of his body moving, his expressions changing, without his conscious consent. It was like watching a horror movie where he was the unwitting star, and his own flesh was the set. He tried to think of a code word, a distress signal, anything. He glanced at the emergency broadcast button, a red, tempting target. If he could just hit it. But the compulsion was too strong. His hand, instead of reaching for the button, moved to adjust his microphone. A perfectly natural movement that served only to keep him in place, continuing the broadcast. The entity was one step ahead. It anticipated his every move, every rebellious thought, and twisted it to its own advantage. "Tonight," Michael announced, a terrifying gleam in his eyes, though he fought against it, "we're going to open some of those doors. Not with a key, but with a question. A question that demands an honest answer, even from the darkest corners of your soul." He paused, the silence stretching, pregnant with unspoken dread. Sarah, listening intently, felt a shiver run down her spine. This wasn't just a strange broadcast anymore. This felt dangerous, like Michael was being forced to expose something or someone. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Was it a prank? A new edgy segment? But the fear in his voice, barely masked by the forced bravado, felt too real. Michael felt a profound exhaustion settle over him, a weariness that went beyond physical fatigue. It was the exhaustion of a soul fighting against an overwhelming current. He knew he was being used. He was a conduit, a mouthpiece for something ancient and malevolent. And the listeners, his loyal audience, were unknowingly tuning into a confession, a ritual, a terrifying unraveling. He felt the next words forming, a cold dread washing over him as he recognized their sinister intent. They were designed not just to unsettle, but to provoke, to expose. And he was the one who had to deliver them. "So, my friends," Michael said, his voice now a chilling blend of command and despair, "let's play a little game. When was the last time you truly looked at your reflection in the dark? And what did you see staring back?" He ended the sentence with a breathy, almost guttural laugh that made Sarah drop her phone. It clattered to the floor, the chilling sound of Michael's forced laughter still echoing from the speaker. This was no game. This was something far, far worse. And Michael, the comforting voice of her sleepless nights, was trapped in a nightmare from which there seemed to be no escape. He was no longer just a radio host. He was a prisoner broadcasting his own demise, one terrifying sentence at a time. Michael's voice, now laced with a thin, almost imperceptible tremor, continued to fill the airwaves. He was playing a dangerous game, one where the rules were dictated by an unseen tormentor, and the stakes were his very life. Each word was a tightrope walk over an abyss. He had to convey his distress, communicate his captivity, without overtly alerting his captor, who was undoubtedly listening to every syllable. He glanced desperately around the small windowless room, the air thick with the smell of stale coffee and something metallic he couldn't quite place. The microphone, once his conduit to connection and joy, now felt like a leash. He cleared his throat, trying to sound as normal as possible, a monumental effort when his heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. All right, folks, we're coming up on the top of the hour. Before we go to a quick break, I just wanted to share something personal. You know, sometimes in life you hit these moments where everything just shifts, where the familiar becomes utterly alien, and you realize how fragile everything truly is. He paused, letting the words hang in the air, hoping Emily, or anyone paying close enough attention, would catch the subtle undertone of desperation. Across town, Emily was hunched over her laptop, her fingers flying across the keyboard, typing Michael's words into a search engine. Familiar becomes alien, she muttered, a knot tightening in her stomach. She knew Michael. She knew his rhythms, his expressions, his subtle tells. This wasn't just a late-night philosophical musing. This was a coded message, she was sure of it. She pulled up a map of the city, zooming in on the radio station's known location, then expanding her search to nearby industrial areas, abandoned warehouses, anything that fit the description of alien or unfamiliar, for a man who spent his life in a studio. Meanwhile, Michael continued, his voice carefully modulated. I'm looking around right now, and I'm seeing things differently. The walls, they feel closer. The silence between songs, it's deafening. It's a strange kind of broadcast tonight, isn't it? Almost intimate, like we're all in this tiny space together. He hoped the mention of tiny space and closer walls would paint a mental picture of confinement for anyone listening with a suspicious ear. He risked a quick, furtive glance towards the dark corner of the room where he knew his captor lurked, a silent, menacing shadow. He couldn't see them, but he felt their presence, a cold, oppressive weight. A low, guttural chuckle, barely audible over the airwaves, sent a fresh wave of dread through Michael. The captor was playing with him, allowing these veiled pleas for help, perhaps even enjoying the macabre spectacle. It was a twisted game of cat and mouse, and Michael was firmly the mouse. The voice, calm and chillingly composed, came through his earpiece, a private channel only he could hear. Clever, Michael. Very clever. But remember who holds the reins. And remember what happens if you stray too far from the script. Michael swallowed hard, his throat suddenly dry. He had to be more careful. He had to be subtle. He launched into a story, ostensibly about a listener who had written in, but every detail was a carefully crafted breadcrumb. I got an email earlier today, he began, his voice regaining some of its usual warmth, a mask he hoped was convincing, from a listener named David. David was telling me about a new job he started. Said it was in an old industrial park, lot of concrete, not much light. Said the air in there was different, had a metallic tang to it, and the sound, he said there was this constant low hum, like old machinery even when everything was off. Gave him the creeps. He described the fictional industrial park in intricate detail. The peeling paint on corrugated iron walls, the smell of damp earth mixing with grease, the way sound echoed strangely in the empty spaces. He even mentioned a specific detail. David said he noticed a faint orange glow from a broken neon sign across the street, illuminating a faded number 7 on a rusted gate. Said it was the only splash of color in an otherwise gray landscape. Michael prayed this fabricated detail, combined with the earlier clues, would resonate with someone, anyone, who might be trying to locate him. He was essentially sketching a map with words, hoping someone could follow it. Emily, listening intently, immediately picked up on the shift. David? Michael never talks about specific listener emails like this, she murmured, her eyes scanning the map. She filtered her search to industrial parks, then looked for any street views or satellite images that showed a 7, or an orange glow near an industrial gate. Her heart pounded with a mix of fear and exhilarating hope. He was giving them clues. He was fighting back. Meanwhile, the captor's voice in Michael's ear was a low growl. "You're pushing it, Michael. That's a lot of detail for a listener email. Remember the rules. No direct calls for help. No revealing your location. Just setting the scene for a good story, boss," Michael replied, trying to sound nonchalant. His voice only audible to the captor through the isolated mic. People love a good mystery. Builds suspense. He hoped his quick thinking would appease them, at least for a moment. He knew he was walking a razor's edge. He transitioned seamlessly back to his broadcast. "So David, he was a little spooked, but he kept going back. He said the strangest thing was the silence. Not the absence of sound, but a presence of silence. As if the building itself was holding its breath. And he felt watched. Always watched." Michael's voice dropped, becoming almost a whisper, creating a chilling effect for his listeners. He wasn't talking about David anymore. He was talking about himself. The captor remained silent for a moment, and Michael braced himself for the inevitable consequence. Instead, the voice simply said, "Continue with the weather, Michael." And then an old classic. Something mournful. Something fitting. The implication was clear. The captor was enjoying the macabre narrative, a twisted puppeteer pulling the strings of his radio host. Michael quickly rattled off the weather report, his mind racing. The weather? What could he do with the weather? He tried to infuse a subtle urgency into his tone. And for tonight, we're looking at clear skies but a definite chill in the air. Temperatures dropping significantly after midnight. So if you're out there maybe looking for something, make sure you're wrapped up warm. Because it's going to get colder before it gets warmer. He hoped the looking for something part would be another tiny nudge. He then announced an old blues track, something suitably melancholic. As the music filled the airwaves, he leaned back in his chair, taking a shaky breath. He had given them so much. Would it be enough? Could anyone piece together his fragmented distress signals? Emily, on the other hand, was making progress. She had cross-referenced industrial park locations with any known abandoned structures or properties that might have a 7 on them. There were a few possibilities, but one stood out. An old textile mill shut down decades ago, known locally as the 7 Looms because of a faded, rusted sign above its main gate that indeed showed a large, stylized number 7. Satellite images confirmed the presence of corrugated iron, vast concrete spaces, and an overall desolate appearance. It was on the outskirts of the city, in an area notorious for its industrial past. She pulled up Street View, zooming in. The neon sign Michael had described, even if broken, would have been highly distinctive. She squinted, her heart hammering. There it was. Not a neon sign, not anymore, but the faint outline of where one had been, just across from the 7 gate. And a faint, almost imperceptible orange discoloration on the weathered brickwork beneath it. It was old, faded, but she knew it. Michael wasn't talking about a new job for David. He was talking about his prison. A cold dread washed over her, quickly replaced by a surge of adrenaline. Michael was there. He was alive and he was trying to communicate. But he was also in grave danger. She knew she couldn't go in alone. This wasn't a game. This was a kidnapping. She had to call the police. But who would believe her? A radio host sending coded messages through his show? It sounded like something out of a bad movie. She remembered Detective Miller, the officer who had handled her stolen car last year. He had been kind, thorough, and had a reputation for taking even the strangest cases seriously. She dug through her phone contacts, her fingers trembling as she found his number. She took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing mind. She needed to sound credible, coherent, and utterly convinced. Michael's life depended on it. As the mournful blues track faded, Michael took another deep breath, steeling himself for the next segment. The captor's voice returned to his ear. "Time for another call-in, Michael. And this time, let's make it interesting. Let's make it personal." A shiver ran down Michael's spine. What fresh horror awaited him now? The game was escalating and he was running out of moves. He could only hope Emily or someone was listening, and that his breadcrumbs were leading them closer, not just to him, but to the truth behind this terrifying ordeal. He picked up the microphone, his hand shaking slightly, and opened the lines. The next voice he heard might be his salvation, or his undoing. And he knew with a terrifying certainty that his captor had something truly malicious planned for this segment. The silence in the room felt heavier than ever, pressing down on him, suffocating him. He was a pawn, but a pawn determined to fight, even if it meant broadcasting his final desperate stand. The red light on the microphone glowed, a malevolent eye watching him, judging his every breath. Michael took a steadying gulp, his throat dry, his heart hammering against his ribs. He was on. He had to speak. He had to fight. But how do you fight an invisible enemy holding all the cards? An enemy who could end not just his broadcast, but his very existence, or worse, someone he loved. He cleared his throat, forcing a semblance of his usual confident tone. Welcome back, everyone. We're diving deeper tonight into the shadows that sometimes lurk beneath the surface of our everyday lives. Stories of things unseen, forces unknown, shaping our world in ways we can barely comprehend. He paused, a flicker of defiance in his eyes as he subtly changed a word from the script's original "shaping their world" to "shaping our world." It was tiny, almost imperceptible, but it was his. A tiny pebble dropped into the ocean of control. A sharp, almost inaudible click sounded in his earpiece, followed by the familiar cold voice. Subtle, Michael. Very subtle. But I hear everything. Don't test my patience. Read the script. Exactly as written. Or your sister, Sarah, might find herself with a very unexpected visitor tonight. Consider that your only warning. Michael's blood ran cold. Sarah. They knew about Sarah. The casual cruelty of the threat. The chilling certainty in the voice, it was like a physical blow. His defiance, that small spark he'd managed to ignite, flickered and threatened to die. He swallowed hard, the fight draining from him, replaced by a suffocating wave of fear. He couldn't risk Sarah. He couldn't. He looked down at the script, the words blurring for a moment before his vision cleared. He had to play their game now, but maybe, just maybe, he could still send a signal. A desperate, silent scream for help woven into the fabric of their narrative. Tonight, he continued, his voice now carefully modulated, we explore the concept of unseen architects, individuals or perhaps groups, who operate in the periphery, influencing events, manipulating outcomes, all while remaining cloaked in anonymity. He read the words, each one a bitter pill, feeling like a puppet whose strings were being pulled by an unseen master. He focused on his breathing, trying to regain some control. The script detailed a shadowy organization, one that supposedly held sway over global events, pulling strings from behind the scenes. It was the kind of conspiracy theory fodder that usually filled the late-night airwaves, but the way it was being presented, the sheer gravity of the situation he was in, made it feel terrifyingly real. Imagine, Michael narrated, trying to inject a skeptical tone, a hint of irony into his voice that he hoped only a perceptive listener might catch. An entity so powerful, so pervasive, that its influence touches every major decision, every pivotal moment in history. A hidden hand guiding the course of nations, shaping economies, even dictating cultural shifts. He forced a dry chuckle. Sounds like something straight out of a blockbuster movie, doesn't it? In his earpiece, the voice was calm, almost amused. Keep it up, Michael. You're doing great. The skeptical angle adds a layer of authenticity. Very clever. But remember, authenticity has its limits. Don't stray too far. He gritted his teeth. They were playing him. They wanted him to sound authentic, to make their fabricated narrative sound plausible, even if he presented it with a veneer of doubt. It was psychological warfare designed to break him, to turn him into their perfect mouthpiece. But what if, Michael continued, now adopting a more serious, contemplative tone as per the script's instruction, the truth is stranger than fiction? What if these whispers of a deep state, of secret societies, aren't just the ramblings of the paranoid, but fragments of a much larger, more unsettling reality? He looked around the soundproof studio. The familiar equipment, the soundboard, the microphones, the array of screens showing silent news feeds. It all looked normal, mundane. Yet he was trapped, a prisoner in his own domain, broadcasting a story that felt less like a theory and more like a confession. His eyes fell on a small, framed photo on the console, a picture of him and Sarah laughing on a beach trip years ago. Her bright, carefree smile was a stark contrast to the grim reality he now faced. The image solidified his resolve. He couldn't risk her. He wouldn't risk her. He would play their game, but he would search for an opening, a crack in their armor. The script tonight delves into a particularly chilling hypothesis, Michael said, his voice dropping slightly, conveying a faux sense of gravity. It posits that this organization isn't merely content with economic or political manipulation. It suggests their ultimate goal is something far more profound, far more insidious. the re-engineering of human perception itself. He paused, letting the words hang in the air, trying to gauge the unseen listener's reaction. The earpiece remained silent, giving him no indication. "They believe," Michael explained, quoting directly from the text, "that by subtly altering the information we consume, the narratives we accept as truth, they can shape our collective consciousness. They want to control not just what we think but how we think. To guide our beliefs, our desires, our very understanding of reality." This was it. This was the core of their message. This wasn't just about a hidden power. It was about psychological control, mass manipulation on an unprecedented scale. And he, Michael, was being forced to be a part of it, to disseminate this very idea. The irony was suffocating. He was a tool in their plan to reshape reality, by broadcasting a story about a plan to reshape reality. The script speaks of psychological architecture. Michael continued, trying to sound intrigued, despite the revulsion churning in his stomach. A systematic approach to influencing public opinion, eroding critical thinking, and fostering a pervasive sense of helplessness and dependence. They want us to believe we are incapable of governing ourselves, that we need a guiding hand, a benevolent authority to make decisions for us. He felt a shiver run down his spine. It wasn't just a story anymore. It felt like a manifesto, a declaration of intent, and he was the messenger. This organization, Michael elaborated, allegedly operates through various channels: media outlets, educational institutions, even popular entertainment. They plant ideas, nurture certain narratives, and subtly discredit dissenting voices. The goal, ultimately, is to create a compliant populace, one that accepts their version of truth without question, without resistance. He looked at the digital clock ticking away the seconds of his broadcast. Time was running out, not just for this segment but for him. He was delivering their message, but he still had to find a way to undermine it, to leave a breadcrumb trail for anyone listening who might be able to see through the layers of deception. He thought of Emily, the caller from earlier. Would she be listening? Would she pick up on his subtle cues, his forced tone, the underlying desperation? He hoped so. He desperately hoped someone out there was sharp enough, brave enough, to understand what was truly happening. "The document I'm reading from tonight," Michael said, deviating slightly from the exact wording, injecting a personal note. "It describes a world where freedom of thought is an illusion, where every choice, every belief, has been carefully curated." It's a chilling prospect, isn't it? The idea that our minds are not our own, that our realities are engineered. The earpiece crackled. "Excellent delivery, Michael. The personal touch really sells it. One more deviation like that, however, and Sarah might find herself in a very real, very uncurated situation. Stick to the text. We're almost at the next transition." His heart sank. They weren't just listening. They were analyzing, dissecting his every word, every inflection. They were far more sophisticated than he'd imagined. His tiny acts of rebellion were noted, catalogued, and immediately countered with a chilling reminder of his vulnerability. He took a deep breath, trying to calm the tremor in his hands. He was trapped, truly trapped. The only way out was through. He had to finish this broadcast, deliver their message, and hope that somewhere, somehow, someone would hear his true plea, hidden beneath the carefully constructed layers of their narrative. He was their voice, but he would try to make that voice crack just enough for the truth to seep through. He had to. For Sarah. For himself. For anyone who might be able to help. He looked directly into the camera lens, though he knew no one on the other side could see him. "Perhaps," he said, his voice now imbued with a carefully crafted blend of solemnity and a hint of something else, something undefinable. "The greatest illusion is not what they show us, but what they prevent us from seeing. The true power lies not in controlling the narrative, but in controlling the very mechanism of truth itself." The words felt heavy, laden with a double meaning only he and his unseen captor understood. He was broadcasting their truth, but he was also broadcasting the terrifying reality of his own controlled existence. The segment was drawing to a close, and Michael knew the next part would bring him even closer to whatever twisted climax they had planned. He was a pawn, yes, but a pawn now desperately searching for a way to flip the board. He was a pawn, yes, but a pawn now desperately searching for a way to flip the board. The silence that followed the last segment was different. Not merely a break in transmission, but a heavy, deliberate pause, as if the entire world was holding its breath, waiting for Michael to make his move. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drum solo in the quiet studio. He looked at the clock, the digital red numbers glaring back at him. 2:47 a.m. The night was bleeding into morning, and with each passing minute, the reality of his situation became more concrete, more terrifying. This wasn't a prank, not a dream. This was his life being systematically dismantled piece by piece live on air. Then the voice returned. It wasn't the usual producer's cue, nor the familiar chime of a station ID. It was the controller, calm and steady, but with an edge that spoke of absolute, unyielding authority. "Michael," the voice began, "I sense a shift in your demeanor, a flicker of defiance, commendable in its own way, but misplaced. You are still playing my game on my board. And now, Michael, we move into the next phase. We call this segment, The Reckoning." A chill snaked down Michael's spine. The reckoning. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken threats. He gripped the edge of the console, his knuckles white. He had to respond, had to maintain the charade of control, even as his world crumbled. A reckoning for whom? Michael managed, his voice steadier than he felt. And for what, exactly? The controller chuckled, a dry, humorless sound that seemed to echo from every corner of the room. "For the truth, Michael. For the lies we tell ourselves, the secrets we bury, and the prices we ultimately pay. Tonight, Michael, you will facilitate a reckoning. Here is your next task." A new monitor, previously dark, flickered to life on his console. On the screen was a single image, a grainy black and white photograph of a man Michael vaguely recognized. A man in his late 50s with kind eyes and a receding hairline. Below the photo, a name, David Miller. David Miller, the controller's voice continued, is a respected local journalist, known for his investigative pieces and his unwavering integrity. He's about to publish a major expose on corruption within the city's zoning commission. A real hero, wouldn't you say? Michael stared at the image, a knot forming in his stomach. What does David Miller have to do with any of this? Everything, Michael. You see, David has a secret. A very deep, very damaging secret that, if revealed, would not only destroy his career, but also shatter the lives of his family. A secret that would make all his investigative work, all his integrity, seem like a cruel joke to the public. Michael's mind raced. He knew the type of story the controller was hinting at. The kind that destroys reputations not just for the individual but for everyone associated. And you want me to what? Expose him? Precisely, the controller said, the word dripping with satisfaction. You have a choice, Michael. You can either read this document, live on air, detailing every sordid detail of David Miller's hidden past, effectively ending his career and public standing before his important expose can even see the light of day. Or, the pause was excruciating. Michael's breath hitched. Or, the controller continued, you can refuse. And if you refuse, Michael, I will ensure that not only is David Miller's secret revealed, but also that his entire family faces the full, unadulterated public scrutiny and harassment that comes with such a revelation. And, the voice added chillingly, I will ensure that your station, Michael, the one you've dedicated your life to, suffers a fate far worse than mere cancellation. Think of the legal battles, the public outrage, the complete destruction of everything you and your colleagues have built. The choice, Michael, is yours. Destroy one man or watch an entire institution and his family burn. Michael felt a cold dread spread through him. This was a new level of cruelty. Before, the attacks felt personal, aimed at him. Now they were forcing him to be the weapon, to inflict damage on an innocent external party, with devastating consequences for refusing. He looked at the document that had appeared on the screen, a file full of text, undoubtedly the damning details of David Miller's life. He couldn't do it. He wouldn't. But the threat to the station, to his colleagues, Jessica, Emily, the entire crew, he couldn't be responsible for that. His mind was a whirlwind of fear and desperate calculation. He needed a way out. He needed a way to signal for help, to expose this madman without caving to his demands. He remembered the old radio trick, the subtle inflection, the coded word, the slightly off-kilter phrase that only a true listener would catch. But the controller seemed omniscient. He had to be careful. This is insane, Michael whispered, hoping his mic wasn't open yet, but knowing it probably was. No, Michael. This is accountability. The controller corrected smoothly. A reckoning. Now the clock is ticking. You have 5 minutes to make your decision and begin. And remember, Michael, any deviation, any attempt at subterfuge, will be met with immediate and amplified consequences for David Miller and his family. And for your station, I am listening and I am watching." The monitor with David Miller's picture zoomed slightly, as if to emphasize the man's vulnerability. Michael felt a surge of nausea. He looked at the clock again. 4 minutes and 45 seconds. He closed his eyes for a split second, taking a deep, shaky breath. He couldn't destroy David Miller, but he also couldn't allow the station to be destroyed, or David's family to be tormented. There had to be another way. He opened his eyes, a desperate resolve hardening his gaze. He had to play along, at least partially, but he had to find a loophole. He had to send a message. He looked at the document again, skimming the first few lines. It was indeed a detailed account of a deeply personal scandal, something involving an affair and financial misconduct from years ago, carefully hidden. The kind of thing that could absolutely ruin someone. Michael took another deep breath and clicked his mic open. "All right," he said, his voice strained but trying to project professionalism. "All right, listeners, we're back. And as promised, this next segment is going to be illuminating. We're calling it The Reckoning. And it concerns a man many of you know, a man respected in our city, David Miller." He paused, his mind racing, trying to craft his words. He had to read something, but could he twist it? Could he make it sound like a warning, a plea for help, rather than an accusation? "David Miller," Michael continued, forcing himself to read from the document on the screen. "A name synonymous with journalistic integrity. A man who has dedicated his career to uncovering truths, exposing corruption, and holding power accountable. A true pillar of our community." He emphasized pillar, hoping it sounded sarcastic enough for someone to catch. He continued reading, his voice carefully controlled, but internally he was screaming. He read the damning details, but with a subtle, almost imperceptible shift in tone. He added small, nearly imperceptible inflections, focusing on the act of revelation rather than the content itself. He inserted pauses where they weren't natural, hoping to break the rhythm, to make anyone question why he was reading this. "This document," Michael said, looking directly into the camera embedded in his console, a silent challenge to the controller, details a past that David Miller has meticulously kept hidden. A past that, according to this information, would shatter his public image. It speaks of an indiscretion years ago, and financial irregularities that were supposedly covered up. He felt a wave of self-loathing wash over him even as he spoke. He was doing it. He was destroying David Miller. But he also knew that if he didn't, the consequences would be far worse. He tried to think of a phrase, a code word, something to embed. "It raises the question," Michael improvised, deviating slightly from the script, "of how much we truly know about the people we admire. How much control others have over our lives even years after our mistakes. How easily secrets can be weaponized. How thin the veil of privacy truly is in this connected world." He stressed control and weaponized, hoping they were heavy enough. He continued, reading the more explicit details, his voice hollow. He felt sick. He was effectively tearing down a man he didn't even know. A man who was fighting his own battles against corruption. He was being made into a monster. Suddenly, a small, subtle flicker on his main monitor caught his eye. It wasn't part of the controller's interface. It was a digital artifact, almost like a glitch, in the bottom right corner of his screen. A quick flash, too fast to properly register, but it was there. And then it was gone. He tried to dismiss it as a technical issue, but his gut clenched. Felt too deliberate. He finished reading the most damaging parts, his voice barely a whisper by the end. The silence that followed was agonizing. He had done it. He had played the controller's game, but he hoped he had planted enough seeds of doubt, enough coded desperation, for someone to pick up on it. "And there you have it, listeners," Michael said, forcing a semblance of his professional closing tone. "The truth as it has been revealed tonight. A harsh reckoning for David Miller, and perhaps for all of us." Just as he thought he might have a moment to breathe, to process the horror of what he had just done, the controller's voice returned, devoid of emotion. "An admirable performance, Michael. You followed instructions for the most part. However, your little improvisations, your attempts at subversion were noted. You tried to warn them, didn't you? To tell them about control and weaponized secrets? Very clever." Michael's blood ran cold. The controller knew. Of course he knew. "But you forget, Michael. the voice continued, now with a hint of menace. I control this broadcast. Every signal, every frequency, every word. And while the public heard your reckoning of David Miller, your little coded messages, they were never actually broadcast. They were scrubbed in real time, replaced with innocuous filler. Your audience heard only the facts you were forced to read, nothing more. You destroyed David Miller's reputation, Michael. And you did it for nothing. Michael felt the air leave his lungs. He stared at the monitor at David Miller's photograph, now replaced with a graphic for the next segment. He had been so outmaneuvered, so thoroughly played. His attempts at resistance were futile. His desperate signals erased before they even reached an ear. He had condemned David Miller, all for a ghost of a chance that never even existed. The controller was not just listening. He was editing reality, twisting Michael's desperate pleas into nothingness. The game was far more elaborate, far more insidious than he could have ever imagined. And the next segment, Michael knew with a sickening certainty, would bring a personal reckoning unlike anything he had faced before. He was trapped utterly and completely. The studio lights, once a comforting glow, now felt like the harsh glare of an interrogation room. Michael's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat echoing the terrifying realization that had just slammed into him. Trapped, utterly and completely. He stared at the microphone, a silent, menacing sentinel, knowing that every word he spoke or didn't speak was being orchestrated by an unseen puppet master. The silence in the control room was profound, yet Michael could almost hear the chilling chuckle of a mind far more patient, far more twisted than he could comprehend. Then a new voice, not the synthesized one, but a different, clearer, yet equally distorted male voice, seeped through his earpiece. It was calm, almost conversational, but laced with an undeniable edge. Michael, are you comfortable? Good, because we're about to get very uncomfortable. For you, that is. A cold dread coiled in Michael's stomach. This wasn't the usual digital manipulation. This was a direct, live feed from his tormentor. Who are you? Michael whispered, his voice barely audible even to himself, his hand instinctively reaching for the broadcast mute button, only to find it unresponsive. The voice chuckled. Asking the wrong questions, Michael. We're past who. We're on to why. Why you, Michael? Why this show? You see, you're not just any host. You're a host with history. A history you've tried very hard to bury. A new file appeared on Michael's screen, not a text document but a faded photograph. It showed a younger Michael, perhaps in his late 20s, standing awkwardly next to a woman with bright, hopeful eyes and a determined set to her jaw. Beside them, a man in a rumpled suit, holding a stack of papers. The location was a dusty old newsroom, long since closed down. Michael felt a jolt of recognition, a memory he'd meticulously locked away. Remember Jessica Hayes, Michael? The voice in his ear purred, dripping with mock nostalgia. Bright, tenacious. Believed in the truth, didn't she? Unlike some others. Michael's blood ran cold. Jessica Hayes. The name was a phantom limb, an old ache he'd learned to ignore. She had been an investigative journalist, a mentor of sorts, back when Michael was just starting out, eager to make a name for himself. She had been working on a story, a truly explosive one, about a shadowy network of influential figures involved in questionable land deals, shell corporations, and a pattern of silencing dissent. It was a story that could have brought down empires. She came to you, didn't she? The voice continued, its tone shifting to a sharper, accusatory edge. With her findings. With her evidence. She trusted you, Michael. She thought you were different. You were going to help her expose it all. Michael felt a wave of nausea. He remembered. He remembered every agonizing detail. Jessica had been vibrant, fearless. She had uncovered a web of corruption that stretched through local government, real estate developers, and even touched some of the station's own silent investors. She had brought him everything, binders full of documents, encrypted files, whispered testimonies. She wanted to break the story on his fledgling investigative segment. But you didn't, did you, Michael? The voice was a hammer blow. You stalled. You hesitated. You were afraid. Afraid of the power she was challenging. Afraid of losing your job, your shot at the big time. You dismissed her evidence as unsubstantiated. You called her a conspiracy theorist, in hushed tones to your superiors. And when she pushed, when she threatened to go elsewhere, you leaked her sources, didn't you? Just a little. Enough to spook them. enough to make her story impossible to publish. A different audio clip began to play live on the broadcast, a grainy, distorted recording of a phone conversation. It was Michael's own voice, younger, more desperate. "Look, Jessica, I appreciate the effort, but this is too wild. We can't run with this. It's too risky. You need to back off. These people, they're too powerful." Then Jessica's voice, clear and heartbroken. "Michael, they're destroying lives. This isn't a game. You promised me you'd help. You're just like them, aren't you? Afraid." The clip ended abruptly, leaving a ringing silence in the studio. A silence that felt heavier than any sound. Michael stared at the photo of Jessica, her hopeful eyes now accusing. He had betrayed her. He had sacrificed her truth, her career, perhaps even her safety for his own ambition. He had told himself he was being pragmatic, protecting himself, but deep down he knew the truth. He had been a coward. Jessica Hayes disappeared 6 months after that conversation, Michael. The voice cut through his self-loathing. Her apartment cleared out. Her car found abandoned. The official report? She ran off. Burnout. Too much pressure. But we know better, don't we? You know better. A new image flashed on the screen. A police report dated years ago, detailing the disappearance of Jessica Hayes. Her file was marked cold case. And the story she was chasing, the voice continued, relentless. The network of powerful individuals didn't go away, Michael. It evolved. It grew. It became the very foundation of the power structure we are now dismantling live on air. The same people she was investigating, the ones you protected with your silence, they're the architects of the New World Order. They're the ones who control the narrative, the economy, even the very airwaves you broadcast on. They own this station, Michael. They own David. And they thought they owned you. The implication hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Michael wasn't just exposing a conspiracy. He was exposing the very people he had once shielded, the very system he had benefited from. His past cowardice had paved the way for a greater evil to flourish, and now he was being forced to confront it, not in a quiet confession, but in front of a listening nation. "You're a hypocrite, Michael," the voice stated, devoid of emotion. "You preach truth, but you buried it. You claim integrity, but you compromised it. And now you will pay the price. Not just for your silence, but for your complicity." Michael's vision blurred. The studio, the microphone, the console all seemed to spin. He felt a wave of dizziness, a profound sense of despair washing over him. He had thought he was a victim, a pawn in someone else's game. But the voice was revealing a darker truth. He was a complicit actor, his past actions directly contributing to the very problem he was now forced to expose. He was being made to atone live on air for his own sins. The men Jessica Hayes was investigating, the voice continued, a new urgency entering its tone. They bought up vast tracts of land, not just for development, but for something far more strategic. They formed a consortium, Aegis Industries, a seemingly innocuous holding company. But their true purpose, Michael, was to control critical infrastructure, to monopolize resources, and to manipulate public opinion through the very media outlets they secretly acquired. This station was one of their earliest acquisitions, a quiet little jewel in their crown. Another image appeared on the screen, a corporate organizational chart, sprawling and complex. At the top, a logo, a stylized shield with a single watchful eye. Beneath it, names Michael recognized, powerful figures in finance, real estate, and media. And then a name that made his stomach drop, Robert Sterling, the station owner, the man who had given Michael his big break. Robert Sterling was Jessica's primary target, the voice revealed. He was the architect, the puppet master. He silenced her, Michael. And when you hesitated, when you failed to act, you gave him the opening he needed. You indirectly helped him bury her and her story. The weight of this revelation was crushing. Robert Sterling, his benefactor, his boss, was not just part of the conspiracy. He was at its very heart. And Michael, in his ambition and fear, had been a tool in Sterling's arsenal, albeit an unwitting one. "But we have a chance to make amends, Michael," the voice said, a chilling thread of hope woven into its malice. "You, the compromised host, will now become the unwilling instrument of truth. You will expose Aegis Industries. You will expose Robert Sterling. And you will do it live for all of America to hear." Michael looked at the screen, at the corporate chart, at Robert Sterling's name highlighted in red. He looked at the microphone, a conduit not just for his voice, but for his penance. He was no longer just a radio host. He was a confessor, an accuser, a man haunted by his past, forced to confront his demons in the most public way imaginable. The airwaves hummed with unspoken tension, the entire broadcast now a crucible for Michael's soul, forging a path he never chose, towards a truth he had once buried. The personal reckoning had begun, and it was far more devastating than he could have ever conceived. The receiver clicked in Michael's hand, a sound like a gavel striking, sealing his fate. The silence that followed was not empty. It was a vast, echoing chasm, overflowing with the ghosts of his past. He could feel the weight of countless listeners, their breath held, their anticipation a palpable force pressing in on him through the glass of the sound booth. His carefully constructed world, built on years of calculated ambition and self-preservation, was now crumbling brick by agonizing brick. "Michael," the voice, now calm, almost tender, seeped from the speaker. "Do you remember the night of October 23rd? 10 years ago. A crisp, clear autumn night. The kind where the stars seem impossibly bright, yet the air carries a chill that whispers of winter." Michael's breath hitched. October 23rd. The date was seared into his memory, a brand on his soul. He gripped the microphone stand, his knuckles white. What are you talking about?" he stammered, his voice a raw rasp, barely recognizable even to himself. The professional veneer had shattered, exposing the terrified man beneath. "You know exactly what I'm talking about," the voice replied, devoid of judgment, yet heavy with an undeniable authority. "The night Sarah Miller died." The name hung in the air, a bell tolling for a memory Michael had meticulously buried beneath layers of success, therapy, and willful amnesia. He felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead, trickling down his temples. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat demanding release. He could almost hear the collective gasp of his audience, the sudden, sharp intake of breath as the pieces began to click into place for them, just as they were now brutally reassembling in his own mind. Sarah died in an accident," Michael choked out, a desperate attempt to cling to the official narrative, the one he had helped craft and propagate. "An accident, yes," the voice conceded, almost too readily. "But accidents often have causes, don't they, Michael? And sometimes those causes are complicated, especially when fear and a certain kind of ambition get in the way." Michael swallowed hard, his throat dry and constricted. He could feel his carefully constructed composure unraveling. He remembered the party, the late-night drive, the argument bubbling under the surface. Sarah vibrant and full of life, her laughter echoing in the car just moments before. "You were driving that night, weren't you, Michael?" the voice continued, soft as a whisper, yet each word a hammer blow. "You had too much to drink. Sarah had begged you to let her drive. But you, Michael, you always had to be in control, didn't you? Always had to be the one at the wheel, steering your own destiny, even if it meant risking someone else's." The accusation hung heavy, undeniable. Michael squeezed his eyes shut for a brief, agonizing moment, the images flashing behind his eyelids. The sharp turn, the screech of tires, the sickening lurch, the impact. The world spinning, then darkness. And then the silence. The terrifying, absolute silence after the chaos. He remembered waking up, dazed, disoriented, the scent of burning rubber and gasoline thick in the air. Sarah was slumped beside him, unmoving. He remembered the panic, the overwhelming visceral terror, not just of the accident but of what it meant for his burgeoning career, his carefully cultivated image. He was on the cusp of his big break. A regional radio show was within his grasp. All of it, everything, could vanish in an instant. "You got out of the car, Michael," the voice pressed, as if reading his very thoughts. "You saw her. You checked her pulse. It was faint, very faint, but it was there. And then you made a choice, didn't you?" Michael shook his head, a silent, desperate plea. No, I called for help. I swear I called for help." The words tumbled out, a frantic, unconvincing defense. "You called an ambulance," the voice corrected, "but not immediately. First you called someone else. Someone who could help you manage the optics. Someone who could make sure your career wasn't derailed by a moment of youthful indiscretion." A cold dread settled deep in Michael's stomach. He remembered that call. Not to emergency services, not first. To his mentor, a powerful figure in local media. A man who knew how to make problems disappear. He had been terrified, desperate to protect his future. His mentor had arrived quickly, assessing the scene with a chilling calm. He had orchestrated everything: the narrative, the statement. Michael, the shaken survivor; Sarah, the tragic victim of an unavoidable accident. Your mentor, Michael. A man who taught you how to play the game, how to spin a story, how to bury the inconvenient truths under layers of plausible deniability. The voice continued, each word a chisel chipping away at Michael's carefully constructed facade. He arrived before the first responders. He moved things, removed things. He made sure the scene told your story, not the whole truth. Michael's shoulders slumped. The weight of it all, the guilt he had suppressed for a decade, now threatened to crush him. He had convinced himself it was for the best, that Sarah was gone, and nothing he did could bring her back. He had convinced himself he was simply a victim of circumstances, that his mentor was just helping him navigate a difficult situation. But deep down he knew, he had chosen ambition over responsibility. He had chosen his future over Sarah's memory, over the truth. You left her, Michael, the voice stated, the you resonating with an unspoken accusation. You knew she was still alive, even faintly. But you also knew that if she survived, if she ever spoke, your perfectly planned ascent would be over. So you left her in that wreckage, knowing the fire from the engine was starting to spread. You walked away and let nature, or perhaps something more sinister, take its course. The word struck Michael like a physical blow. He gasped, a guttural sound of pure agony. He remembered the flickering orange glow, the acrid smell of burning, the heat on his back as he stumbled away. His mentor guiding him, whispering assurances of a bright future if he just kept quiet, if he just played along. He had convinced himself she was already gone, that the fire was a mercy, erasing the evidence of the crash. But the voice was right. He had known. He had felt the faint flutter of her pulse. He had made a choice. No, I didn't mean for her to die in the fire, Michael sobbed, his voice cracking, raw with despair. It was an accident. Panicked. I was scared. Scared of losing your dream. The voice finished for him, devoid of sympathy. Scared of facing the consequences. You let her burn, Michael. You let her become a statistic, a cautionary tale for drunk driving, while you soared to stardom on the ashes of her memory. The studio was silent except for Michael's ragged breathing, amplified broadcast across the city, across the nation. He was exposed, laid bare. The carefully curated image of the charming, witty radio host was gone, replaced by a broken man, haunted by a decade of lies. And then you took her song, the voice added, a new, sharper edge to it. The lullaby she used to sing, the melody she wrote. You claimed it as your own, a tribute to a lost love, a poignant touch for your burgeoning radio persona. You built your empire on her grave, Michael. You profited from her death, from her art, from her very essence. Michael flinched. The lullaby. He had even used it as his show's intro music for a time. A subtle nod, a twisted homage. He had rationalized it, told himself it was keeping her memory alive. But now, under the brutal glare of truth, he saw it for what it was. A grotesque appropriation, a final sickening act of theft. Who are you? Michael finally managed to ask, his voice barely a whisper, defeat heavy in every syllable. How do you know all this? A long chilling pause. Then the voice softened, losing its digital edge, becoming strangely human, yet infinitely more terrifying. You know me, Michael. Or rather, you knew me. I was there. I watched you walk away. I saw the fear in your eyes, the calculation. I heard your mentor's whispered instructions. I saw the flames consume her, and the last flicker of hope die in my heart. Michael's blood ran cold. The implications were staggering, impossible. No, that's impossible. You were dead. Was I? The voice responded, a ghost of a chuckle devoid of humor. Or was I just another inconvenient truth, buried beneath the rubble of your ambition? You see, Michael, for 10 years I've been listening. To your show. To your platitudes. To your carefully crafted persona. And for 10 years I've been planning this broadcast. This final, honest broadcast. The voice hardened again. Every word now sharpened with an icy resolve. My name is Daniel. Daniel Miller. Sarah was my sister, Michael. And tonight you won't just confess to the world. You'll answer for what you did. For every lie. For every calculated step you took over her body. The reckoning has come, Michael. And it's far from over. The studio lights flickered, a sudden ominous sign. Michael stared at the muted microphone, his reflection in the glass a distorted image of terror and despair. Daniel, Sarah's brother, the boy who had adored his older sister, who had always looked up to her. He remembered Daniel, a quiet, intelligent kid, devastated by his sister's death. He had offered his condolences, played the role of the sympathetic friend, all while knowing the truth. The silence returned, heavier now, filled with the undeniable weight of a decade's worth of betrayal and a brother's relentless pursuit of justice. Michael felt a profound, chilling certainty. This wasn't just about a confession. This was about vengeance. And he was trapped, alone in the glare of the broadcast, awaiting the final, inevitable hammer blow. The air in the studio grew impossibly thick, imbued with unspoken tension. The entire broadcast now a crucible for Michael's soul, forging a path he never chose, towards a truth he had once buried. The personal reckoning had begun, and it was far more devastating than he could have ever conceived. The air in the studio grew heavy, thick with the weight of Michael's unspoken past. He could feel the eyes of millions on him, but more acutely, he felt the unseen gaze of the caller, a silent prosecutor in this grim courtroom of the airwaves. Every second was a hammer blow, chipping away at the carefully constructed facade of his life. He stared at the blinking on-air light, a mocking beacon of his impending ruin. Michael, the voice, calm yet chillingly precise, cut through the silence. Do you remember the night of October 23rd? 10 years ago. A celebration, wasn't it? Your first big solo show. The ratings were through the roof. You were on top of the world. Michael's breath hitched. October 23rd. The date clawed at the edges of his memory, a dark stain he had tried to scrub clean. His hands trembled, gripping the edges of the console. What are you talking about? He stammered, his voice a raspy whisper, barely audible over the hum of the equipment. Don't play coy, Michael. Not now. Not when the world is listening. That night, after the champagne and the backslapping, you left the station. Excited, invincible, and perhaps a little too confident behind the wheel. A cold dread seeped into Michael's bones. He remembered the euphoria, the blur of the celebration, the foolish decision to drive despite the celebratory drinks. He remembered the rain, the slick streets. He remembered the impact. A sickening thud, a flash of something in his headlights. There was an intern, Michael, the caller continued, each word a slow, deliberate twist of a knife. A bright, hopeful young woman. Sarah Miller. She was walking home after her shift, dreaming of a future in radio, just like you once did. And you hit her, didn't you? The studio seemed to spin. The walls pressed in. Sarah Miller. The name ripped through the decade of denial, tearing open a wound he thought had scabbed over. He saw her face now, not just a fleeting image from a news report he'd glanced at, but a vivid, horrifying memory of a young woman he'd briefly seen around the station. He'd convinced himself it was just a deer, a phantom of his drunken panic. But the caller knew. The caller knew. You didn't stop, did you, Michael? The voice pressed, devoid of emotion, yet radiating an infernal judgment. You drove away, left her there broken in the rain, and then you used every connection, every ounce of your charm to bury it, to make it disappear, to blame a phantom driver, to manipulate the investigation, to let her family believe it was just a tragic accident, an unsolved mystery. Tears welled in Michael's eyes, hot and stinging. The confession was a physical force tearing at his throat. He wanted to deny it, to scream that it wasn't true, but the words wouldn't come. The truth, long suppressed, was now a roaring current, sweeping away his defenses. Emily knew, didn't she? Michael choked out, the words barely coherent. She saw something. Emily was your friend, Michael, the caller replied, a hint of sorrow now in the otherwise monotone voice. She was also Sarah's friend, and she saw you. Not the impact, not directly, but she saw your car speeding away from the scene minutes after. She knew it was you. She tried to tell someone years later when her conscience finally broke. She tried to tell me. Michael's mind raced, piecing together the fragments. Emily, his old friend, his confidant. She'd been increasingly distant, troubled. He dismissed it as stress, a personal crisis. But she was trying to expose him. And he had subtly, cruelly sabotaged her career, spread rumors, isolated her. He hadn't killed her, but he'd effectively erased her from his life and from the industry, ensuring no one would listen to her wild accusations. He'd made her disappear in a different, more insidious way. And David? Michael whispered the name, a plea for mercy. David, he was Sarah's brother. He went looking for answers. I am David, Michael, the voice resonated, the revelation hitting Michael like a physical blow. The calm, composed voice that had haunted him for hours, that had manipulated his broadcast, that had orchestrated his downfall belonged to David, Sarah's brother. The ghost of his past finally manifest. You don't know the decade of hell I've lived, Michael, David continued, his voice now laced with a raw, controlled fury. Watching you rise, listening to your voice, knowing the truth you buried beneath your fame. Emily came to me years ago. She was broken, tormented by what she knew and what you had done to her to keep her silent. We tried to find a way to expose you, but you were too powerful, too well connected. So I waited. I learned. I planned. Michael slumped forward, his face in his hands, the microphone picking up his ragged breaths, his stifled sobs. I'm so sorry, he choked out, the words hollow, inadequate. I never meant for any of this to happen. I panicked. I was scared. Scared. David's voice hardened, razor sharp. Scared of losing your precious career? While Sarah lost her life, and her family lost their future. While Emily lost her sanity and then her freedom because she dared challenge you. Sorry isn't enough, Michael. Confession is just the beginning. Michael lifted his head, his eyes red-rimmed, staring blankly at the studio clock. The broadcast was still live. Every agonizing word, every tear, every confession was being beamed across the nation. His career, his reputation, his entire life was crumbling around him, live on air. What do you want from me? Michael pleaded, his voice cracking. I've confessed. I've told the truth. What more can I do? Justice, Michael, David's voice replied, and there was a strange, almost serene finality to it. True justice. You built your empire on a lie in this very building. This station, this show, it's all tainted by what you did. And now it will all come crashing down. Suddenly, a low rumble vibrated through the studio floor. The lights flickered wildly, the hum of the equipment rising to a frantic whine. Dust began to drift from the ceiling, tiny flakes at first, then larger chunks. Michael looked up, fear seizing him anew. What's happening? He cried, his voice laced with terror. This old building, Michael. David's voice was fading now, growing distant, as if from a great distance. It has a history, a foundation that's been eroding for years. Just like your conscience. I've simply helped it along. The weight of your lies, Michael, it's too much for this place to bear. A loud crack echoed from somewhere above, followed by a sickening groan of metal and concrete. The ceiling tiles began to fall, shattering on the console. The main studio light fixture above Michael swung wildly, sparks showering down. The entire room tilted, a terrifying, surreal sensation. No, what have you done? Michael screamed, scrambling back from the console, his eyes wide with horror as a massive crack snaked down the wall behind him. The final broadcast, Michael. David's voice was barely a whisper now, distorted by static and the growing cacophony of destruction. A fitting end. You'll be buried with your secrets. In the very place you built your false legacy. Just as Sarah was buried alone because of you. The floor beneath Michael's feet gave way with a deafening roar. The console exploded in a shower of sparks and smoke. The microphone, still technically live, picked up Michael's final desperate cry, a primal scream of terror and regret, before everything plunged into absolute darkness and silence. The broadcast, Michael's final involuntary confession, cut out abruptly. The airwaves went dead. Across the nation, listeners were left with nothing but the chilling echo of a man's last moments, the sound of a building collapsing, and the horrifying truth of a long-buried secret finally brought to light. The silence that followed was more profound, more terrifying than any scream. The doomed radio host had indeed made his final broadcast, and his fate, sealed by his own hands, was now irrevocably intertwined with the very foundations of his deception. The station, a monument to ambition and lies, had become his tomb.